With no end in sight of the US-Israel war on Iran, US President Donald Trump has turned his attention to Cuba.
What's happening with Cuba is amazing, and we think that we want to finish this one first, but that will be just a question of time before you and a lot of unbelievable people are going to be going back to Cuba.
Well, Trump doubled down on these comments in a later interview, predicting that Cuba's communist-run government would fall soon. Now, Cuba has been struggling under the effects of an energy blockade imposed by Trump's White House back in January. The blockade added to a long-standing US trade embargo, and it's put more pressure on Cuba's struggling economy and has triggered serious power outages. Havana has accused Donald Trump of deliberately trying to sabotage its economy. Let's get some analysis now. And joining me is Will Freeman, Fellow for Latin America Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He joins me from New York. Great to have you on DW News. What did you make of Donald Trump's statement that, quote, Cuba is gonna fall pretty soon?
Well, that's more or less what he's been saying for the past several weeks or months. And we are seeing a Cuban regime, it's seemingly in a weaker state than we've maybe ever seen it. We're looking at potentially the deepest economic crisis, not only since the 1990s, a very bruising time for Cuba when Soviet support dried up, but actually since the 1930s. So it seems plausible to me. That said, a million times before, the United States has predicted the end of the fall of this regime, and it hasn't happened. So I think we have to wait and see.
Tell me a little bit more about the current situation in Cuba. I mentioned it there earlier. You've just said it there. I mean, you know, it's no shock that the economy is not in great shape. But how much pressure is Havana under, and Cuba as a whole under, both economically and politically at the moment?
I think the regime is under huge pressure. You're bordering on the brink of a total collapse of the energy grid in Cuba. That's since Venezuelan oil was shut off with the extraction and arrest of Nicolas Maduro and the new U.S.-Venezuela relationship that's formed there. That had been the main source of fuel imports into Cuba, which is, of course, energy dependent. It relies on importing fuel to power its energy grid. That's a large source of its energy. And then you had Mexico continuing to send oil for a time, but then Trump put or threatened secondary sanctions on any countries that still supplied oil. So what you've seen is, you know, the government, the regime in Cuba about 20 days ago saying that they were effectively looking at running out of fuel completely. Now, it doesn't seem that's quite happened yet, but we are talking about blackouts so prolonged, so severe that you're even hearing reports of residents of Havana being able to see stars, right? And again, that's in the capital. I mean, so little light shining that they're able to see stars in the night sky.
Yeah, absolutely. How is all of this affecting then the average Cuban?
Well, it seems they're continuing to live under extreme hardship. I would say that we can't just analyze that in isolation from the political regime they live under, which is authoritarian, of course, which has essentially modeled the island's economy for the last 20 years to serve a small clique of military and civilian rulers. You know, this is a military regime. I think we need to be reminded of that, right? You know, the same way Pinochet was a military dictator in Chile, and there was a military junta in Argentina, and many other countries in Latin America. The military has that same outsized political power in Cuba. Really, it's the decision maker, and that's why, for me, it's not surprising that we've heard at least about these alleged supposed negotiations between some military officials and the Trump administration.
Yeah, well, actually, let's bring in Trump again, because he made reference to Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, and sort of said that he, you know, kind of hinted at the possibility that he's going to go over to Cuba. Let's just also remind our viewers that Rubio is the son of Cuban immigrants to the United States. How much is Marco Rubio driving White House policy towards Cuba?
I would assume very much so. I think in general on the Western Hemisphere portfolio, which has of course been very important for this administration, at least until Iran. We'll see how much of that persists. But within that portfolio, Marco Rubio is clearly the member of the administration with the deepest knowledge. I think he often has his hands on the steering wheel. And for Cuba, I mean, this is something from at least according to the reporting, he's been talking and dreaming about since he was a kid, right? And many people in the Cuban American community here in the United States, of course, waiting for this day when potentially there's political change on the island.
Are we going to see perhaps a more diplomatic approach to Havana?
Well, so what we see, what we've heard reported is that there are these conversations, these negotiations going on between some figures of the regime and the Trump administration. Now, the regime in Cuba denies that. The Trump administration has made, at least some anonymous sources in the administration have made kind of oblique reference to it. But I would place a decent amount of credibility behind those reports. So it depends what they're able to work out. I do think that you have a sector of people in Cuba who have continued to benefit immensely off of an extremely unequal economy and off of their total political and near total economic control. And they are, really going to be loath to give up those immense privileges that they have. And allow for an economic revitalization, allow for the kind of political change which will probably be necessary to allow for those economic reforms. They have a lot to lose here. And I think they know that if ultimately political change goes through, they're likely going to end up in prison or exile. I mean, has been what's happened to dictators in Latin America before.
What's the sentiment in Cuba towards we'll say the U.S. administration, the government at the moment there?
It's pure guesswork, really, to try to answer that question, because, of course, this has been a closed authoritarian regime for over 6 decades. There is not reliable public opinion polling. There's anecdotal reports. People go to Cuba, they talk to people. But even then, you can't be entirely sure that you have a real reflection of public opinion because, of course, there's huge disincentives to speak positively of the United States or negatively of the regime. But I would say, I think what we could make an educated guess, is that there's a broad-based consensus that there needs to be economic change and reform. I mean, who in their right mind, besides this small sliver of military officials that runs all the businesses, who in their right mind would want this status quo to continue? Clearly no one. I mean, people are suffering greatly because of this. I'm guessing that on political questions, there's a strong majority in favor of change and opening and democracy, but there's probably a minority, especially in the older generation, that does still perceive that they have something to lose from that kind of political change. So I think that there's probably some degree of division there. Again, very hard to say what size minority still supports the regime. I will mention that there were massive protests in July 2021, massive for Cuba, where there's been such repression that kind of demonstration hasn't been possible, and which really suggested that people were discontent. And then you also have had since 2021, 2 million or so of the 11 million inhabitants of the island becoming migrants and refugees. So that's a massive vote with one's feet. Right, that is a massive sign of discontent and protest. And so if that's literally we're seeing 2 out of 11 million people uprooting their lives because they're so discontent, I can only imagine how deep and broad the discontent is, even if often it has to be kept secret among the population that remains on the island.
Well, if you had a crystal ball now, what's your prediction of the path that we're going to see Cuba take?
I would say that there's a chance that the Cuban regime tries to make cosmetic changes. It reshuffles figures at the top. Maybe we see Miguel Diaz-Canel, the current leader, sacrificed to give the Trump administration the impression that something similar is unfolding in Cuba as to what happened in Venezuela. So a leadership change at the top and then seemingly in alignment with the U.S. I think they're going to try to make those changes as superficial and cosmetic as possible. I think we're going to see the United States push for much deeper forms of change, maybe starting with economic opening, allowing for a real private sector in Cuba for the first time, and then later pushing for, maybe pushing harder and faster than in Venezuela for a real political transition to follow. Again, I do think that the military in Cuba is going to try to limit the scope of that and really resist it tooth and nail as much as they can.
All right, we'll leave it there. But really great to get your insights, Will. It's, I mean, I've been to Cuba. It's a fascinating place, and we'll be keeping a close eye on this story. Will Freeman, Fellow for Latin America Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, joining us from New York. Thanks so much, Will.
Thank you.
And as always, let us know your thoughts and send us your questions on this topic. Cuba, of course, is a fascinating country, and with the developments that we're seeing at the moment, it's always great to get your thoughts too. All right, we'll leave it there. As always, thanks for watching DW News. Take care.